recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ambassador Yovanovitch, I want to follow up on some of the questions from my colleagues. Some of the early questions seem to suggest that your testimony here was completely irrelevant to the issues at hand. Why are you even here? Isn't this just some small matter that should have been referred to HR? So I want to bring our attention to someone who thought you were actually very important to this whole plot or scheme, and that is the President of the United States. There was only one ambassador, I believe, who was discussed by the President in the July 25th call, and that was you, Ambassador Yovanovitch. And I want to refer back to how you were brought up in that conversation. At one point during the conversation, the President brings up this prosecutor who was very good, and it was shut down, and that's really unfair. And I think you indicated earlier that that was a likely reference to Mr. Lutsenko, the corrupt prosecutor, is that right? I
believe that is the case, but I don't know.
So immediately after the President brings up this corrupt former prosecutor, only one, I'm sorry, my staff has corrected me, only one American ambassador is brought up in the call. Immediately after the President brings up this corrupt prosecutor that he praises and says he was treated very unfairly, he then encourages Zelensky to speak with Giuliani, the guy who orchestrated the smear campaign against you, correct?
Yes.
And he then brings you up. So he praises the corrupt prosecutor. He says, I want you to talk to Giuliani, the guy who smeared you. And then he brings you up. He obviously thought you were relevant to this. But what is even more telling is immediately after he brings you up and says that you, the woman, was bad news, he says there's a lot to talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that, so whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Immediately after praising this corrupt prosecutor, he attacks you, and then he goes right to Biden. That would indicate to you, wouldn't it, Ambassador, that he connects you somehow with this prosecutor you were at odds with and his desire to see this investigation of Biden go forward, would it not?
Again, you're absolutely right that that is the thought progression.
My colleagues also asked, in pushing you out of the way, ultimately Ambassador Taylor got appointed. Is Ambassador Taylor the kind of person that would further Giuliani's aims? And I think we can all agree that Ambassador Taylor is a remarkable public servant.
Absolutely.
But what if the President could put someone else in place that wasn't a career diplomat? What if he could put in place, say, a substantial donor to his inaugural? What if he could put in place someone with no diplomatic experience at all? What if he could put in place someone whose portfolio doesn't even include Ukraine? Might that person be willing to work with Rudy Giuliani in pursuit of these investigations?
Yeah, maybe.
That's exactly what happened, wasn't it?
Yes.
And my colleagues also say, well, the security assistance ultimately went through. So if they sought to condition or bribe Ukraine into doing these investigations by withholding security assistance, they ultimately paid the money. Are you aware, Ambassador, that the security assistance was not released until after a whistleblower complaint made its way to the White House?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Are you aware that it was not released until Congress announced it was doing an investigation?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And finally, I want to ask you about the call record that my colleague read at the outset. I'm curious about this. And just for people watching at home so they're not confused, there are two calls here. There's the perfunctory congratulatory call after Zelensky is inaugurated, which my ranking member read this morning. And then there's, of course, the very problematic call in July. And one of the reasons we are here is what happened between April and July. But there was a readout put out by the White House at the time the April congratulatory call was made. And the White House readout said that the president discussed with Zelensky helping Ukraine root out corruption. Now, that in fact doesn't appear anywhere in that call. So I want to ask you, Ambassador, why would the White House put out an inaccurate reading? Why would the White House represent that the president said something about corruption when he said nothing about corruption in that call or, in fact, in the one in July?
I can't answer that question. I don't have visibility into that.
I thank you. I yield now 5 minutes now to recognize the ranking member.